I remember the morning it all broke. I was sitting in the drive-thru of a fast food place, because that was how I spent a lot of my mornings back then, and my GP's office sent me a text. Pre-diabetic, 51 years old, decent salary, a company car, health care benefits, and I was reading a medical diagnosis while idling in a parking lot. That was the moment I decided to quit. Not the Sunday dread that had been building for years. Not the insomnia that had me lying awake at 2 a.m, running logistics through my head. Not the company software that tracked every minute of my working day. It took a blood test result, delivered to my phone while I was sitting outside a burger restaurant, to finally do what I'd been telling myself I would do eventually. If you're in your 30s or 40s right now, I need you to hear this before you end up in that same parking lot. Because the decision I made at 51, with under 20,000 pounds in savings, no pension I could access, and no real plan, turned into the best year of my life. And I'm going to show you exactly how I got there, what the behavioral psychology says about why you're probably stuck right now, and the 3 specific things I would do completely differently if I were your age. Here's where it gets interesting, and this part took me way too long to understand. The reason most people stay in careers that are making them miserable isn't weak willpower. It isn't laziness. It's something far more deeply wired. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, identified a principle called loss aversion. The core finding from his landmark 1979 research with Amos Tversky, published in Econometrica, is that the psychological pain of losing something feels roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value. What that meant for me in practical terms was this. I was far more afraid of losing my salary, my company car, my benefits package, than I was excited about the freedom I might gain by leaving. I was running the math wrong, and my brain was helping me do it. Kahneman wrote in Thinking Fast and Slow that this isn't a character flaw. It is literally how the human mind is wired. You are not weak for staying in a bad situation. You are biologically wired to stay in it. And I'll say this. I think knowing that fact is the exact moment the trap becomes breakable, because the trap is only invisible until someone names it. On top of loss aversion, there's a second force at work. Nobel laureate Richard Thaler introduced the concept of mental accounting, the idea that we unconsciously organize our money and our resources into separate mental categories that we treat very differently. I had placed my salary, my car, my title into the non-negotiable category. And I had placed my health, my time, my Sunday evenings, my actual life into the optional extras category. This is the core mechanism of the rat race. The system doesn't trap you with chains. It traps you by getting you to treat the paycheck as a fixed constraint and everything that actually matters as a discretionary bonus. By the time you figure out the categories are backwards, a decade has passed. So let me tell you what actually happened when I finally made the call. One morning, I'd been with a new employer for about 8 months, back in the same industry after a redundancy the previous year. I picked up the phone and called my manager. No warning, no transition plan lined up. I just said I was done. My colleagues were shocked. "Take it back," they said. "They'll let you take it back." But I knew something they didn't. I wasn't quitting the job. I was quitting the version of myself I had become in order to keep doing it. I had a motorhome I used maybe twice a year, a motorbike, a collection of vintage watches and sports memorabilia I'd been accumulating for 30 years, and under 20,000 pounds in liquid savings. My pension fund was locked until I turned 67. I owned my home outright, no mortgage, which turned out to matter enormously. And I had no real plan. What I did have was a piece of paper where I had done some brutally honest math. How much do I actually need? Not to maintain the lifestyle I'd built for someone else's approval, not to impress anyone, just to pay the council tax, the utilities, eat decent food, and have the occasional treat. I worked it out to about 1,000 pounds a month. That number changed everything. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely in Predictably Irrational explains that concrete specific targets activate a completely different part of your decision-making brain than vague aspirations. When you give your brain a real number, the abstract fear loses its grip. 1,000 pounds is a target. More security is a fog. The first thing I did was look around my house and ask, What have I been emotionally hoarding that's worth actual cash? I had vintage watches I'd bought in the 1990s for £150, 200 each, that were now selling for £900, £1,400 on resale platforms. Sports memorabilia that had been sitting in a cupboard untouched for 15 years. I started selling, and something completely unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not just financially, emotionally. This is what psychologists call the endowment effect, first described by Richard Thaler and Daniel Kahneman. We systematically overvalue things we own simply because we own them. Clearing it out wasn't just revenue. It was a psychological release I didn't know I needed. Now here's the data that should concern anyone watching this who's in their 30s or 40s and thinking, I can't do what he did. Because the question isn't whether you can quit tomorrow. The question is why you are so certain that staying is safer than changing. Harvard economist David Laibson published research on hyperbolic discounting, the documented tendency for humans to dramatically overweight immediate costs and benefits while underweighting future ones. That's why you'll choose the safe paycheck today over the possibility of a life you actually want in 5 years. That's why you'll book a vacation the minute you feel burned out, but not revisit your career direction, even though the career decision is worth orders of magnitude more to your long-term well-being. And you're not alone in this. According to a 2023 Gallup Global Workplace survey of over 120,000 employees across 160 countries, 59% of workers describe themselves as quietly disengaged, showing up, going through the motions, not contributing much, and not particularly caring. That's not a rounding error. That is the majority of the working world. And a 2024 American Psychological Association report on work and well-being found that 44% of American workers say their job causes them significant stress, with adults age 35-49 reporting the highest rates of work-related anxiety across all age groups. So if you are sitting in your mid-30s or early 40s right now feeling trapped, you are statistically the norm, not the exception. Stick with me here because I want to tell you what I would actually do about it. If this is resonating with you, hit subscribe. I put out one video a week at the intersection of behavioral psychology and practical financial design, and drop a comment below. What's the one thing keeping you in a situation you already know isn't right? I genuinely read everyone. If I could go back to age 35 with what I know now, there are 3 concrete things I would do that I simply didn't do. The first is build my minimum viable income number early. Not in a crisis at 51, but at 35 when compounding and optionality were both still wide open. Morgan Housel writes in The Psychology of Money, and I think this is one of the most important sentences in personal finance. The ability to do what you want, when you want, with who you want, for as long as you want, is priceless. It is the highest dividend money pays. He calls it the highest form of wealth, not a number, but freedom from having to do things you don't want to do. The data reinforces why timing matters. According to Vanguard's How America Saves 2024 Inches report, the median retirement account balance for Americans aged 35-44 is just $40,128. For those aged 45-54, it rises to $87,571. Meanwhile, Fidelity's 2024 retirement analysis suggests most people in that age bracket need to be between 3x and 6x their annual salary saved by age 45 just to stay on track. There is a gap, a very real, measurable gap. Warren Buffett made 99% of his net worth after turning 50, not because he had some secret strategy in his 50s, but because he started compounding at 11 and simply didn't stop. The compounding is the strategy. Time is the input. The second thing I would do is stack high-income skills deliberately alongside my day job. In my 30s, I was good at one thing. That was my entire professional value. One skill, one industry, one income stream. James Clear writes in Atomic Habits that the most powerful compounding behavior anyone can adopt is identity-based. You don't just want to earn more, you become someone who builds leverage. Take Marcus, a 37-year-old graphic designer I know in Austin. He was pulling $68,000 a year at an agency, could feel the ceiling approaching, and spent 18 months learning motion design and UX consulting on evenings and weekends. He's now freelancing at $95 per hour with clients across 3 time zones. He told me the tipping point was the first week a single client paid him more than he used to earn in a month. I kept waiting for it to feel real, he said. It still does. That's not luck. That's skill stacking with compound interest applied to ability rather than capital. The third thing I would do is deal with my health before it forced me to. At 51, I was pre-diabetic, medicated for blood pressure and high cholesterol, all of which, according to the American Heart Association's 2024 statistical update, are conditions directly linked to chronic occupational stress and poor lifestyle habits in adults aged 40, 60, 1 year of morning walks, 3 simple weight sessions per week, and time-restricted eating later. My blood sugar is back in the normal range. My doctor told me I could reverse it. I didn't believe him. Here's the connection nobody makes clearly enough. Your health and your financial situation are downstream of the same variable, your daily habits, and both compound. A small investment in your health at 36 pays dividends your 60-year-old self will spend. Now let me give you the behavioral finance layer, because this is where I think most personal finance content completely drops the ball. There's a concept called status quo bias, documented by economists William Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser in their 1988 paper in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty. The finding is that people show a strong, irrational preference for the current state of affairs. We perceive any change as a loss, even when the data objectively says the change is beneficial. This explains why millions of people hold savings in accounts paying 0.1% interest when high-yield accounts at 4.5%. 5% are one 10-minute application away. It explains why most people never rebalance their investment portfolio even when they know the allocation has drifted. And it explains with painful clarity why I stayed in a role I hated for longer than I care to admit. The antidote to status quo bias in practical terms is what behavioral economists call a commitment device. You make the structural decision once, so your future anxious self cannot quietly undo it. An automatic investment contribution, a standing order into a low-cost index fund the day your paycheck clears. Not a plan to invest, an actual automatic investment. Fidelity's research on 401k participant behavior has consistently shown that employees who are auto-enrolled in retirement plans have dramatically higher savings rates and participation than those who must opt in manually. The default setting of a system governs more behavior than willpower ever will. And here's my honest take on something that'll probably ruffle some feathers. I think the personal finance industry is largely built around selling you complexity. Complexity that keeps you dependent on advisors, keeps you paying management fees, keeps you anxious enough to feel like you need the product. The straightforward truth, and I say this as someone who learned it the hard way after decades of ignoring it, is that a low-cost index fund, invested consistently and automatically over a long time horizon, outperforms most actively managed portfolios. J.L. Collins makes this case exhaustively in The Simple Path to Wealth, and the Vanguard data backs it up. Over 20-year rolling periods, S&P 500 index funds outperform roughly 85-90% of actively managed funds. The problem isn't that you don't know this. The problem is that loss aversion and emotional investing bias will override your rational plan the moment the market corrects 15%, which it will. Which is precisely why building the system and understanding the psychology of why you'll want to sabotage it matters more than picking any specific stock or fund. A year after quitting, here's where I actually am. I start most mornings with a 5-mile walk along the river. I train with weights 3 times a week, rows, presses, squats, nothing fancy, just enough to preserve muscle mass as I get older. I eat in a time-restricted window during weekdays and eat whatever I want on weekends. I'm not pre-diabetic anymore. I sleep 7 to 8 hours a night, which sounds almost embarrassingly simple until you remember that I used to be awake at 2 a.m., replaying my calendar. My income comes from reselling vintage items and a growing digital content project. Some months are leaner than others. My minimum viable income, that 1,000 pounds a month number, is consistently hit. And here's the calculation that genuinely stunned me when I first ran it. My actual cost of a good life, the life I'm living right now, is about 40% lower than the life I was living before, the one I thought I needed to keep that salary to sustain. I had a motorhome I used twice a year, a motorbike that mostly sat in the garage. Subscriptions and memberships accumulated through years of buying things to compensate for a life I hadn't actually chosen. Psychologist Tim Kasser at Knox College has spent decades publishing research on materialism and well-being. His findings consistently show that people who organize their lives around acquiring money and possessions report significantly lower life satisfaction, more anxiety, and worse relationships than those who prioritize time, autonomy, and connection. The things I kept buying to feel better about my job were making it harder to leave. That's a trap with its own physics. So here's the specific challenge I want to leave you with. Not quit your job tomorrow. Not go live in a motorhome. Just this. Sit down and figure out your minimum viable income number. Write it on paper. Then ask yourself two things. First, how many months of that number do you currently have saved? And second, what percentage of your current monthly spending is genuinely serving the life you want versus compensating for the one you haven't chosen yet? That honest calculation will tell you more about your actual freedom timeline than any investment return spreadsheet. The thing I wish I had understood at 35 isn't a financial formula or a morning routine. It's this: the cost of staying is not zero. Every year spent on the wrong path has a price, measured in compounded stress, in health deferred, in the slow narrowing of the options that were once still open. James Clear puts it better than I can in Atomic Habits. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. I didn't have a system, I had a salary. There is a significant difference between those two things. The year I was 51 was the first year I actually built a system. And if you're watching this in your 30s or early 40s, you have a decade or more of compounding still available to you. That is not a small thing. That is, honestly, everything. In the next video, I'm going to walk you through the exact daily structure I built after quitting. The morning protocol, the work blocks, and the one financial habit I genuinely wish I had started at 30. Until then, drop a comment and tell me, what's the one thing in your current life that your 70-year-old self would be most disappointed you didn't change sooner?